Okay, so in the previous lecture, we were discussing the working of your local area networks, and we started discussing the overall working of your internet and how the internet has been basically created over the years. And now let's look at the overall working and the configuration of the internet with respect to its architecture. And as I mentioned before, there really is no architecture. There is no hierarchy with respect to the internet. But now we'll be looking at this now. Okay, so if there is any hierarchy with respect to the internet, it will be definitely based on the internet service provider. So that is the only way you can see that there is any sort of hierarchy whatsoever. Okay, now what is internet service provider? Internet service provider is basically the company, in simple terms, the terms we studied earlier in O levels, for example. Internet service provider, by definition, is a company, is an organization that has invested in some sort of architecture that allows internet connectivity with its users. But that is just, the tip of the iceberg in terms of describing internet service providers. Internet service providers are actually divided into three tiers. So we got the tier 1, the tier 2, and tier 3. The tier 1 are referred to as your backbone internet service providers. Then the tier 2 are referred to as the middle tier, and the tier 3 are referred to as the access tier. Now, what is the primary difference between these three? We'll look into it. But first of all, let's look at the logic behind internet service providers. By simple logic, the internet service provider is a company that provides internet access. The most common ISPs are the ones that deliver internet connectivity to your home. So that is the tier 3, the access internet service provider, the access tiers. So we are directly communicating with the tier 3 internet service providers. In reality, internet service providers operate in three tiers: the tier 1 backbone, tier 2 middle tier, and tier 3 access tiers. Connection between these internet service providers are handled through internet exchange points and locations where different internet service providers meet to exchange local traffic via a switch. So obviously, there will be some exchange of information between tier 1 and tier 2, and obviously tier 1 and tier 1s as well. But what is that position where I'm exchanging information at between these internet service providers? That is known as the internet exchange point. So all of the internet service providers are connected through internet exchange points, right? Now, let's look at what internet service providers, the different tiers, what is the primary difference between the different tiers that we are discussing today, that are actually active today. Let's start with the tier 1. Now, by looking at this diagram, it's actually quite evident that tier 1 is providing some source to tier 2, and then tier 2 is providing information to both all three tier 3s, like so. And apart from that, tier 1s can also communicate with other tier 1s. So that's what this diagram is basically saying, and that is actually true. Tier 1s are allowed to communicate with other tier 1s as well. Now, before we begin, what is a tier 1 internet service provider? In simple terms, a tier 1 internet service provider is such an internet service provider that is basically responsible for connecting, say, continents on our planet. So that should also mean that these, by the way, this diagram represents the underground fiber optic cabling that exists as of 2019. This is the network of fiber optic cabling, submarine cables, that are used to connect our entire country together, our entire world together, allowing for a global access of internet services. Now, these submarine cables are basically responsibilities of tier 1s. So tier 1 internet service providers are also known as the backbones as well. So because they are connecting different continents, different land masses together, allowing for a wider range of, now again, as mentioned before, We may not have needed this fiber optic cabling if we had, you know, solved the problem with microwave access and satellite communication. But as mentioned before, satellite communications has its own problems. And that is primarily, even though microwave has a very fast data transfer rate as compared to fiber optics, much faster. But the reason microwaves are not used right now is because of their distance from the surface of the planet. And that distance, despite being faster, that distance attributes to delays in data transfer. So that's why when I have when I want internet access globally, I have to rely on this huge network of fiber optic cables. And if, for example, we were relying on microwave data transfer and we were relying on satellite transfer for global internet communication, we would not have needed these fiber optic cables. But believe it or not, they seem complicated, but they're actually a cheaper solution and faster solution considering that they're on the surface, so there's no distance. They're a cheaper and faster solution as opposed to your satellite communication. So that's one aspect. That's why we're still using this. So as far as tier one goes and this internet underground cabling goes, these cables are basically installed and possibly maintained by the tier one internet service providers. This tier one exchange traffic with other tier ones through what is known as a peer one agreement. What a peering agreement is that, okay, now let's try to understand the hierarchy of, imagine this entire network being set up by a tier one. Who's paying for that? I mean, this is very expensive installations. Who's paying for that? We are. Our average internet user is paying for this. Now, the way the payment system works in internet service provider is that a tier one, say, let's just say that this is a tier one internet service provider that is operating in North America. And this is a tier one internet service provider that is operating in, say, Asia. Now, they are supplying information to their own tier twos, middle tiers, and those middle tiers are thereby providing internet services to their access tiers. And we are accessing these access tiers to grant internet access. Now, we are paying for the amount of data we're using to these tier threes. And tier threes are paying an amount based on the information they're downloading from the tier twos. And tier twos also pay some money to tier ones. So if you think about it, it's actually the money is circulating because of us. So basically these tier ones, they are investing their money on this, they're using that money to maintain and upgrade these fiber optic cables, submarine cables. On the other hand, let's just say, for example, I use my tier 3 internet service provider to access a page sitting in Asia. I'm accessing a page which is not accessible through Asia right now. And it's not, by the way, this tier 3 internet service provider, let's say, for example, it doesn't have it. And I want to access a page that is only available to North America, that's currently being hosted in North America somewhere. So I access this web page through tier 3. Tier 3, of course, doesn't have it. It asks tier 2. Tier 2 doesn't have it. Tier 2 will ask tier 1. Tier 1 doesn't have it. But tier 1 has an agreement with this tier 1, the North America tier 1, that whenever I need a page that I don't have and is hosted on your server in North America, you will give it to me for free. This Asian tier 1 has an agreement with this North America tier 1 that whenever I want to access a page that I don't have and you have on North America, it's based on North America, you will give it to me for free. All information that I want to access that's based on North America, you will give it to me for free. And in exchange for your information, I will give you all information that you might not have and I, as an Asian tier internet service provider, will have. And basically these two tiers are exchanging information amongst themselves for free. And this is known as peering agreement. So as far as information goes, tier ones are not making money from each other off of that, at least. They are making money from the lower tiers, but amongst tier ones, there's a peering agreement. So it simply means that I provide you the information that you don't have. In exchange for that, you provide me for information that I don't have, and that's how we're gonna work. So that's a peering agreement. Now, this is what a peering agreement. On the other hand, Tier 3 operates purely on a purchase model. So what it means that it's getting its money from us based on how much information we're downloading. So you can see, you remember that many internet packages exist, and they per MB data, per GB data of download, you are downloading packages, you're paying for packages, and basically they are based on how much data you download. So that is a purchase model, purely purchase model. And Tier 3 is receiving its information from Tier 2, of course, and Tier 3 has to pay a premium to Tier 2 as well, so for the information it's getting from Tier 2. And Tier 2 is paying a premium to Tier 1s for the information it's getting from Tier 1s. But here's the catch. Tier 2 doesn't necessarily only pay money. It may also exchange data through a peering agreement with Tier 1 as well. Now, Tier 1 to Tier 1 is purely peering agreement. There's no exchange of money whatsoever. However, Tier 2 to Tier 1 may involve partial monetary transfer or purchase model and partial peering agreement. Now, what that means is, let's just say, for example, Tier 2, since it's a pretty big internet service provider on its own, may have access to data on its own, relatively new data on its own as well. So it will say to its Tier 1, its immediate Tier 1, that, okay, I downloaded Tier 2 to Tier 1. I downloaded 10 MB data, for example, just for example. I downloaded 10 MB data from a Tier 1. Okay, so that means I have to pay for 10 MB. Tier 1 says, yes, of course you have to pay for 10 MB. But Tier 2 says, let's do this. I'll give you 5 MB of data that you don't have, and I'll pay for the other 5 MB because that's information that I downloaded from you. So basically, it's a partial peering agreement that exists between Tier 1 and Tier 2. So Tier 3 doesn't have any of its own information whatsoever. So it's purely relying on purchase model, where the relationship between Tier 2 and Tier 1 is a partial purchase model. And the remaining balance of MBs downloaded from Tier 1 is balanced through exchange of information from Tier 2 to Tier 1. So if I download as a Tier 2, if I download 10 MB of data from Tier 1, I can pay for half of it, and the remaining 5 MB, I will give the Tier 1 exchange of 5 MB data, which it did not have previously. So that's a partial peering agreement. And so this is basically the arrangement, this is the hierarchy that's being used in internet services as of today. Okay, not as of today, but today, as it still now at the moment, this is the peering, this is the internet service provider hierarchy that is being used right now. Okay, now let's look at some details here. The Tier 1 exchanges traffic with other Tier 1s through what is known as a peering agreement. Backbones agree to exchange content amongst each other by allowing global coverage. There is also these are also commonly known as okay. So um, talking about Tier 1s, yes. Backbones agreeing to exchange content amongst each other, thereby allowing global coverage. These are more commonly known as the backbones. They are responsible for contributing the internet infrastructure, such as the internet sea cables, underwater fibers like this. Tier 1 internet service provider provide traffic to other tier ISPs and not to end users. So what that means is, as an end user, you have communication only to Tier 3, and there are some examples that you may be communicating directly to Tier 2 as well. But you will never communicate with a Tier 1, never communicate with a Tier 1. So Tier 1s are directly communicating with either Tier 2s or other tier ones. Without them, internet service providers, internet traffic cannot be exchanged between continents and countries. Examples of tier one are Hibernia networks, cogent communications, and level three communications. These are three examples of tier one internet service providers that are currently active right now. Now, tier two internet service provider, which is also known as the middle tier, primarily connect tier threes with tier ones. So that's basically their primary objective, to connect tier threes with middle tiers. Middle tiers with the backbone tier. So that's the sorry, tier threes with tier ones. That's the primary purpose of the tier two internet service provider, is to communicate or allow data transfer from your access tiers to your backbone tiers. Access tiers are tier three and backbone tiers are tier one. They operate on peering agreements as well as purchasing internet transit, data being carried from one network or provider to another for being charged according to the amount of data. So as mentioned before, I can be exchanging data with tier one and use that as a modes of exchange of information, not having to pay for it. And I can also, the remaining data that I download can also be used. There can also be purchased. That I have to pay for half of it, or the remaining amount I may have just access to it, because I can use the information that is that is not available in the tier one. So I can exchange that part for just information exchange, and the remaining I can pay for it. And let's talk about examples of tier two are British Telecom, Vodafone, and EasyNet. So these are examples of tier two. Now let's look at tier threes. Tier threes ISPs solely rely on purchasing internet transit and delivering it to the homes and business. Tier three operates strictly on purchasing model, and they have no information whatsoever on their own, and they have to pay. You pay tier threes, and they have to pay a premium to tier twos, and tier two have to pay to tier one for information exchange as well. So this is basically how the whole tier internet service provider money circulates. Is basically our end users' money. Okay, examples of tier three are Verizon and Comcast. These are examples of tier three internet service providers right now. Okay, apart from that, there's this company of internet service providers in Pakistan as well. They are known as your Transworld. Now, Transworld Internet Services, they have advertised themselves as Pakistan's first tier two internet service provider. So those who don't know this, basically what that means is that you are actually interacting with the middle tier directly. Now, how does that reflect as the overall use? Obviously, there's one less tier to interact with, so that means it may reduce the overall charges, because you don't have to pay. There's less of a premium. I don't exactly know how that reflects in their real purchase, but it should. This is what it should mean, that there is one tier less for you to purchase from. So that means it should result in cheaper. You're accessing another source of information directly in a way, and it should also mean that information access should be also faster in a way. So I'm not exactly sure how that reflects in the internet usage, or in reality, or if it's really just a marketing gimmick calling it as a Pakistan's first tier two internet service provider. But this is what it should mean. So anyway, this is your internet service providers that are currently being used in the internet, and this is the only place that, in a sense, we see hierarchy. We see some sort of formation, some sort of authority levels here. Other than that, internet is basically this giant structure. It's constantly evolving. There's a lot of variety of devices, and because of those large variety of devices, we have to take special precautions when we're relaying communications amongst them. So uh, this is all there is for internet service provider. So in the next lectures onwards, we'll be looking at other aspects of internet service, primarily the role of the router and public switch telephone networks, and what is the different applications of the internet today.